we're coming to a short sort of facilitated session of questions. But what I'm going to do is remind you that we're coming up to an open question and answer session, and you can post your question into the chat addressed to the host. So if you'll see, you can pull down who you're addressing your message to at the bottom of the chat list. And so if you could address it to the host, that would be great. And so I would encourage people to start doing that, because we can build up some questions for the Q&A session. And I'm going to keep my questions quite short, because I want to leave lots of time for people. We're relatively on time, but we don't, I think it would be really great to hear broadly. But to begin, perhaps I could, and you can address your questions to a specific person or to the group, and we'll allow the group to sort of answer as they see fit. My first question is one of those, so whoever would like to tackle this. We've heard some really interesting strategies here. It's fantastic to sort of see how effective people have been at developing strategy in the face of this kind of thing. But many of us are in the situation, and I'm in New Brunswick, so my government is watching this but hasn't done anything yet. And some of us may be in places like New Brunswick that are facing elections, and so we may have more hostile governments coming in. What can faculty associations do to prevent this kind of anti-union and anti-labor legislation in the first place? Are there things that we could be doing well in advance of sort of the reactive and important work once it starts to happen?
Well, Ricardo? I mean, I would argue that the reason we're seeing this move in Alberta to actually stop any political participation or expression or activism by unions is precisely to stop us from doing what we should be doing, and that is getting active and doing what we can to prevent the election of austerity-focused anti-labor governments, right? And I think that's something that at least in Alberta, we don't have a long track record of in terms of the faculty associations. We don't see ourselves being politically active in that way. And you know, we've missed that opportunity. So now we're behind the 8 ball retroactively trying to activate against these things that are already coming down at us.
Janet?
I think another thing that we can do is also really cherish our members. And I'm not sure that we've necessarily done this well enough either, but I've been struck by how many times in even the last 4 months, we've had our members who have written letters to the newspaper that are up there that are just incredibly persuasive and smart. Like, we've got the smartest band of soldiers really at our disposal. And I think that even things like writing them a letter saying, thank you for writing that. That was really, really a big deal. And just encouraging them, making sure that our promotion and tenure committees value that kind of outreach, because that doesn't cost anything. And I think it has a really big impact.
I would just follow on that point that Janet was making. We need really to build, and this has been, of course, a COUT strategy for some years, the mobilization strategy. So building capacity. I mean, too often, and I was, we're on a meeting back in the pre-pandemic period in January, I think, in Ottawa, and we were hearing from members in Alberta, and they were concerned, justifiably, what was coming down. But they were saying that, you know, you really need, and this is true of all provinces, to build the capacity. And following Janet's point, that our members really have a great deal of diverse and unique talents. And so differentiating between, say, some provincial public sector unions, our members have this talent and we can bring to them. So my point would be, ask people to do it, because again, they're not going to volunteer spontaneously. But if you say, you have this skill, can you help us out with this media thing? Or, and voting, electronic voting, we used that in the past. They'll do it. So you'd be surprised how much capacity we have.
Thanks. So I see there are starting already to be some questions in the chat, but I will ask another one before we turn to those. Many of us here are in regions that are currently impacted, but some of us, as I say, are in adjacent regions. What actions might those of us who are in regions adjacent to places that are in conflict right now, do to support or engage in solidarity actions? What kinds of things could we be doing sort of on a national and larger macro regional scale to kind of act together?
Well, I think what's happening within provinces needs to be done between provinces as well. So you saw very effective coalitions, and this involves faculty associations, not only working with faculty associations in other provinces, but working with larger coalitions of trade unions. And you saw that in Manitoba with the Manitoba Federation of Labor Challenge. You're seeing this in Ontario with the OFL Challenge, and I'm sure you're going to see it in Alberta. And what's happening in Alberta is super scary. And it's going to have, if it's successful there, it's going to have an impact on trade union rights, possibly in each and every other province. So I think it's very important that members be educated, members get involved, retired members who have time on their hands and who are bright as always can get involved. I think this is a key time to activate and get members and retired members involved.
One of the points brought up earlier was that we tend to disparage our own reputation publicly. And I know that CAT has done for years polling about post-secondary education. And there is a consistent level of support for post-secondary education and also educators, so faculty and staff. And we tend to think, well, you know, we're cut off and they don't like us. That's mainly because of our experiences, perhaps with our administrations. But we can leverage that if we want to do that, get that kind of public support, because people need to know how this is going to affect these laws, and the most draconian, of course, being in Alberta presently, are going to affect their public education experience. So if you hear from students, and students are always a very important constituency because they really do speak directly to the public, and they say that this is going to compromise our experience. We may want to leave the province and go to another province. That's really going to be one of the few things that will cause something like Jason Kennedy to have pause.
Okay, I'm going to turn to some of the questions from the floor. And the first one is that since so many of the remarks have focused on legislation, what might be our most effective and creative strategies on this front? Given that we're educators and we want the public always on our side, might we not gain by educating the public better on this front?
I feel like I've got a vested interest in this question. I mean, I'm the executive director of a university-based think tank, right? That's Parkland Institute's mandate, and is to get this kind of policy analysis done by folks on campus into the public's hands. And I think we need to do more of that. I think we need to do, coordinate the publishing of op-eds by members, coordinate seminars and sessions, both for the public and for other members, about policy and the implications of policy and how policy works. I think that's a key starting space. It makes me sad to say that if this goes through, one of the organizations that might actually die in Alberta for lack of union funding will be groups like the Parkland Institute that are doing this kind of work.
I would say the issues about governance are important. We do have a system of internal governance, of course, at universities and colleges. Most people don't know about this, and they don't know that we are fairly democratic. And I think that kind of knowledge that these laws really supersede a lot of the process, and also why academic freedom is important. And this is, again, one of these kind of obscure notions for most of the general public, why it's important to us. So rather, we can attack the legislation specifically, but I think these broader concepts to bring in are important as well.
That's great.
Yeah.
Did you want to add to that, Janet?
Well, I just think, yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think it's important to have materials that go all the way from just, a little, for instance, stamp that professors can put on their PowerPoint slides, all the way through to the kind of detailed analysis that the Parkland Institute does and the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives that are longer, more academic kinds of pieces. We need to run the whole gamut on those things to catch as many people as we can, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. So here's another question from the floor. And this questioner is interested in sort of the long view. So Ontario is facing the first term of a Conservative government, but there's evidence to suggest that non-Conservative governments find legislation like Bill 124 too convenient to repeal. In other words, a Liberal win in 2 years does not mean a repeal of 124. Is wage restraint the new normal that will shape our bargaining, or does Manitoba give us hope for something different?
I hope we give you hope. I don't think we don't know yet how that will play out. But I think that's exactly right, that you can't just say that it's Conservative governments that do this. I mean, they're all different types can find this alluring. And I think that, boy, I'm certainly a big fan of the legal profession, because I think they are one of our biggest lines of defense that this is just not right.
I would jump in and say, not that we want to take a lot of examples right now from the United States, but the Red for Ed movement in the last several years has been really important, because we're talking about states that had right to work legislation, had restrictive, they didn't have, and Janus, of course, the US Supreme Court decision has made it even more restrictive, but they made connections between the quality of education and the workplace experience of these teachers. And most of them were women, of course, in southern US states. So there is a cause to be made for this. And that strategy was also followed in the city of Chicago several years ago. So there is some things we can learn. And I think a lot of us don't really think, we just react to the legislation. How bad is it? And it's pretty bad right now, and it could get worse. But what are the strategies? Because these have been tried before.
I think there's an inoculation function that we can be playing as well, right? So in addition to building that popular support and getting community support and support of our members, we need to engage in these conversations with non-conservative parties when they're in opposition, because that's when they'll listen, and actually say to them, look, we've got this level of public support, we've got this level of mobilization, and we're prepared to bring it if you make some commitments. I mean, there was a reason, I started my presentation, there was a reason that the NDP only took us to the middle of the road in terms of labor legislation when they were in power, instead of implementing the more radical ones, is that they didn't think that the labor movement had built the popular support for them to move that far. So we need to do that difficult work on the ground and bring that support to bear on folks before they get elected.
Yeah, I think in the chat, Terry Van Steinberg has echoed some of that, emphasizing that we need to get involved in political action and try to elect progressive governments and then push them as much as we can. Peter, were you just about to follow up before I cut you off there?
I was just going to say, if it's right, Peter, that, I mean, what part of what we're up against in Alberta with the UCP is a long game of political activism coming from the right. I mean, we could look at the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC. I was trying to, just before the town hall, put together a short list of some of the American anti-union think tanks, but it's too long. It's to go through, and there's so much money. And they're playing a long game, and they have been doing this for decades. And it's worth noting. Now, we can't match that, the financial acumen or even the political connections, and clearly they're reaching into people like Jason Kenney directly, and probably the Ford government as well. But we can at least make efforts to coordinate our efforts to fight back more effectively than we've done. So CUT has a role for this. Our provincial associations have a role. But too often, our individual faculty associations are functioning like individual city-states, and they're not actually coordinating to the extent they need to deal with this kind of existential threat.
So a comment in the chat is reflecting an appreciation for your comments there, Peter, on educating the public and community in these government legislations. But the questioner is also interested in mobilization across communities. And so this leads to a direct question for Ricardo. Given Bill 31's intrusion into any dollar spent on political activism by unions, would the creation of an extant fund be a useful strategy? And by extant fund, she may mean election fund. Is that what, is it a typo or is that correct? Maybe we could get clarification on that. But creation of a fund to sort of counteract the intrusion by Bill 31?
I mean, I think there's two things. One, I think it's always positive when labor unions can think ahead and kind of create some of these funds and fund some of these organizations to do some of this work. I think that's always positive. I think we also have a responsibility in light of this to actually work internally. If we have broad majority support from our members for investing in political action, then when they move to this individual kind of opt-in, opt-out process, we don't stand to lose a lot, right? I think part of the fear, to be really brutally honest, is that we don't feel like we've done the work with our membership to convince them that this political action is worth them investing in. So we're terrified that when they get the chance to opt out of it, they will, right? So I think, yes, of course, let's create the funds, let's inoculate these organizations from that potential loss, but at the same time, let's learn the lesson here that if we have 100% of our membership on board with our political action, then we don't really stand to lose anything from this legislation. I mean, yes, of course, there's the intrusions around picketing and all those things, but in terms of funds going to worthy causes, if we've done it right, then we're not going to lose anything.
Yes, and I think you've answered. There was a clarification that she meant an extant fund created by unions to politically organize and get around the restrictions over political action. But I think you've addressed sort of some of the larger issues there. I will ask another one of my questions. I see, and there's a gap in the questions coming from the floor, but we still have time to answer more if people want to ask them. And so my question would be about lessons learned from cases, both successful and otherwise, from outside of the Canadian academic context. So perhaps what can we learn by the imposition of right-to-work legislation in the US, or perhaps the successful legal case in Ontario opposing the government's attempt to introduce voluntary student unionism, so the sort of voluntary dues kind of approach? Are there larger lessons we can draw from those efforts by governments which are really targeting the same broader thing? Are there ways in which we can apply some of those to our circumstance?
Well, I can speak really briefly to the right-to-work experience. Of course, the American case is been a plan, and we were talking about the long game. They were launching on this in the late 1940s, immediately after the conclusion of the Second World War. But while we've seen states that we never expected, like Michigan, go right to work, it did allow the specific unions to build that mobilization model and actually reach out to their people. There was perhaps kind of abstruse academic argument that the RAND formula, the checkoff of dues, disconnected unions from their members. Maybe that was overstated because we needed the money to do all the things that we are necessarily obligated to do. But there is a life after right to work. We don't want to go there. We fought it back previously, but we can learn from the American experience of building a much more mobilizing model, and that they've got their people to sign their cards. And so there has been a drop off of union density in some of these states, but not as much as you might have expected, given the Janice case that we were talking about earlier.
I actually, I think the situation is worse, perhaps, than my colleague in the U.S. I think right-to-work legislation, making the National Labor Relations Board dysfunctional, extending periods of time on certification, making it easier to decertify, taking away any automatic powers of the boards. Governments through legislation have really decimated many American unions. And what worries me is you see this partial right to work stuff now that Ricardo talked about in Alberta. And if that creeps into Canada, we could have serious trouble here. And that of course then creates more inequality, kills a lot of good union jobs, does all sorts of things to our civil society. So I really think what speakers have talked about earlier about educating their members, getting active commitments out of opposition parties in elections about what they're actually going to do to protect collective bargaining rights, very, very important. because legislation can significantly hurt trade union membership. And I mean, and Stu, even in New Brunswick, I mean, you've got a provincial election now. I'm involved in a charter case where the government of New Brunswick took away, through legislation, its public servants' defined benefit pension plans and made them into what they called shared risk, which is employee risk. So, you know, you've got to be careful. These things happen, and politicians should be asked direct questions about what they're going to do about unionized workers and their rights.
I think there's, I mean, it's as Peter suggests, right? This move in Alberta is potentially the thin edge of the wedge, right? Because it is the encroachment of right to work. I mean, it's all about employees being, you know, given the right to choose whether they pay part of their union dues or not. So I think the very kind of visible challenge in the courts is important, but it's also important to challenge the frame, right? I mean, if this is a move designed to shift the Overton window, to understand this notion of worker rights, worker choice, balance in the workplace, then if at the same time as we're challenging it in the courts, we're not challenging it in the kind of realm of public discourse, then we may win the court case, but lose the public support. And that's just as damaging because it does still provide them room to move further in the future.
I think the other thing too, and this is not a nut that I have managed to crack, is young people. I don't think that these kinds of moves are what young people want. I don't think it's the kind of world they want to have. But I think politicians take advantage of the fact that they don't vote. And I sort of think, you know, who has more contact with young people than we do? And if we could figure out how to get them to vote, I think a lot of these problems would be solved, because politicians would know that they're voting and they need to create things the way they want their world to be. I don't know how you do it, but I sort of feel like somehow if we could crack that nut, that would help us a lot.
So I would conclude by saying that I think it's worth telling our members that Canada, in terms of post-secondary education rights through academic freedom, through collective bargaining rights, we have some of the best conditions in the world globally. And a lot of people don't know that. And one of the things that we're losing in the pandemic, of course, is international visitors coming to council and other meetings. And they make that really clear. They say, you know, we're from Australia. We lost this battle. We're from the UK. We lost this battle. Don't give this up. And I remember being warned by some Americans with the AAUP saying, you know, this is coming down. Don't let this be your fate. So if we tell our members, this is really crucial to your academic job and the success of the institutions of which you're dedicating your lives, people are going to get that buy-in a bit more. And that is the starting point from a broader public acceptance.
Well, that comment follows nicely onto the next question from the floor. None of the types of political action so far have touched much on organizing for direct action by members, including the credible possibility of mounting a majority strike. Can other political and legal strategies ultimately be successful if this more fundamental capacity hasn't been built, for example, in Alberta?
No. That's the answer. I said in my comments, right? Like we've got a long way to go at University of Alberta. I'll speak for my association. We've got a long way to go before we're in a position where we feel we could, you know, call a majority strike or drive, you know, a majority of our members to action. So that's the hard work that we need to do now, is we need to talk to the members. We need to organize, do old school organizing and talk to the members one by one, group by group. We need to, you know, call members out to show support for other unions, knowing that at some point we're going to need support from other unions, right? We need to prepare that and do little things in your department, little acts of resistance, and get members used to resisting before we can actually have an impact writ large. And no, of course, the legal strategy, the political strategy are not going to accomplish anything if we don't have our members behind us.
Janet, were you about to say something? I thought nope, okay.
Nope. I'm just stumped.
Yeah, I mean, I think this does speak to that sort of the theme that's emerging here is that this requires collective action, and that we've got to be thinking not only collective action in terms of our own associations, but collective action more broadly. So within, you know, groups of associations, within CAUT. But I guess also we've heard some talk about the importance of coalitions beyond academia and building solidarity and support outside of our unions. And I think this does sort of, we've talked a little bit about the public as a sort of a place where we could build that kind of support. But what about other kinds of organizations? So perhaps maybe a little focus on coalitions with other labor, other kinds of strategies such as this. How can we broaden our networks in those directions?
Well, I can speak
I
to
think,
one of the,
oh, sorry, go ahead, Peter.
One of the issues that came up earlier was the court challenge in Ontario that the Ford government essentially defunded the student groups, you know, political newspapers, all of this, from their continued animus about student activism. CUT, a year ago, we gave some money to the CFS campaign, and that moved sometimes a little bit of support from other associations with a kind of foresight that this is important. And maybe we didn't expect that legal outcome, but it was really, really satisfying and pushed back against that kind of incremental moves to essentially defund. And it's a defunding model that we're seeing beyond just direct right to work. We're seeing a kind of defunding model, which is part of what's being attempted here.
Peter?
Yes, I was just going to say that was a very successful court challenge, interesting challenge. Some very bright young lawyers at our Toronto office were involved, and it really was coming up with non-charter arguments, because the Ford government had talked already about invoking the notwithstanding clause after the City of Toronto case, and they talked about doing it again. So that was a creative challenge. Also some interesting comments in the decision about interference with universities by government and how that played out. But again, that was good coalition. It involved many unions and other groups getting behind the CFS and its members. And quite frankly, you know, one of the most successful and best cases on labor rights and 2D, the Saskatchewan Federation of Labor case, where we really saw not only unions getting together, but trade union lawyers getting together. And I remember when that case was going on at the Supreme Court of Canada, and everybody's on their screen, everybody's typing questions and ideas to the lawyers who are there. Very cooperative, very collaborative. I'm sure that's what happened in Manitoba, and I certainly hope that's what's going to happen in Alberta in the very near future, because these cases are tremendously expensive to run. They're very time consuming. You've got to gather extensive evidence. You want to put your best arguments forward. There's a lot involved. So having the Federation of Labor and other unions from other sectors involved is key.
It also means, I mean, and I'm starting to sound like a broken record, but we've got to show up, right? We can't go out and seek coalitions when we need support with our labor battles. We also need to show up when the LPNs at the long-term care home are picketing for their working conditions, when teachers, if they ever do, picket in Alberta for class sizes. When these other struggles go on, we need to show up. Otherwise, we have no hope of expecting other people to show up for us.
Yeah.
I remember back in the day, I was teaching at the Labor College in Ottawa when the Merv Levine case was decided by the Supreme Court, and this was the Ontario Public Sector's Employees Union, and it was precisely about some of the things affecting Bill 32 in Alberta was the use of funds for political purposes. And I remember that the group of trade unionists I were with, we all broke into a cheer. We won this case. It's a bit disconcerting to see that over 20 years later, we're back into somewhat of the same thing, but it can be done. So there is that legal route, and as noted, it's expensive and convoluted, but there's also the activism. So those two need to be combined. But there's no question that governments that are majority and they have the power to put in really draconian laws, and this makes it very tough for us to fight this type of battle.
Yeah, so thank you for those answers. We have, I think, one last question, time for one last question. And it's certainly Peter Engelman, when you had been giving your comments, you really went over a number of important strategies for collective bargaining in very specific kinds of ways. And that was really something I was interested in, is this notion of how can we effectively bargain in government restricted environments. And a question from the floor takes that a little further and asks how can we implement job actions such as strikes during a pandemic? And if job actions are not the best available options, what are the best alternative to a negotiated settlement? So for post-secondary institutions, such as in Alberta, where this is already rendered difficult.
Well, traditional. Oh, I'm sorry, Janet.
No, you go ahead, Peter, because I'll think more.
Right.
Go.
Okay. Something I should do before I talk as well. But unfortunately, one of the most effective ways in the counterbalance has been binding arbitration and getting very independent-minded arbitrators. But as Ricardo told us, that's been taken away in Alberta. And in Ontario, they've been neutered because they don't have a power to find that the provisions in Bill 124 are unconstitutional. So governments are really attacking that. I think that when you look at the SFL case and recognizing not just that the right to strike is constitutionally protected, but then again, that you need to have other alternatives, whether that's binding arbitration, whether that's other avenues. There is some opening in the law there. Job action right now, I think we all know that the percentage of strikes, and I'm talking pre-COVID, had already gone down tremendously. And of course, the best thing about a strike is a very, very good strike vote and then a settlement just before the strike starts, rather than a long aggravated strike. That's a really good question about how do you do job action in a time of COVID. All I can say is hopefully when strikes occur, they'll occur in warm weather, and unions can not only educate their members, but get them out to picket lines and actually engage in persuasive picketing. I think that's one of the most vulnerable parts of the Alberta law, is those huge restrictions on what has been recognized by our Supreme Court Canada in a case called Pepsi Cola, the importance of freedom of expression in the context of labor relations, and how important that right to try and persuade people not to cross a picket line is. I'm sorry, I don't know if I've really answered the question, but it's extremely difficult if you don't have either the right to strike and a membership that's willing to do it by a large margin, or a binding arbitration alternative.
And I'll add to that as a part of the Collective Bargaining and Economic Benefits Committee, CAUT is really trying to pull together some best practices around how we could handle things like job action in COVID, because we do have faculty associations that are facing this. And so we really are going to sort of come together to try and develop a whole series of new strategies that we can deploy in this context.
Yeah, we're going to be in that situation, and we're going to figure it out, because this is our recourse, and so we're going to make sure that we've got some ideas. We'll let you know. Yep.
Certainly we get better turnout for our faculty association meetings on Zoom than we ever did face-to-face. So there are some positive things. So we have one last question, and we've only got a few minutes left, and this has to do with gender issues in union participation. Women on faculty are already oversubscribed in teaching service and double burdens with childcare, elder care. Any strategies to shift dynamics?
Well, an obvious one, and you would know this, Sue, is to make sure your collective agreement has service to the union as a service to the university. And that's not necessarily the case. And we had to struggle for that a few rounds earlier. And also, I think this needs to be valued more broadly. Again, the gender disparity, but I think there's also a generational thing. And we've noted that as well, the kind of expectations on younger faculty to perform. But we've also seen that this can be really vital to their own career, and it's not some type of eccentric moonlighting. It's actually fundamental to their academic job. So I think I would make that point for all faculty, but especially female faculty.
Scheduling of meetings during the pandemic, I think, is critical. Understanding that the care duties for children, those need to be taken into consideration when scheduling. During the non-COVID times, I think ensuring that not only is there course release for union participation, but that there's actual union compensation to cover things like childcare and transportation and those kind of things were necessary. And I think generally, we need to do a better job of recruiting with an equity lens, not just for gender, but for all types of diversity. It becomes very easy in the union to just keep recycling the same group of people through different positions year after year after year. And if we're not actively recruiting for equity, we're never going to get beyond that.
Yeah, I think we absolutely need to hold our administration's feet to the fire. I mean, when they've got a stated goal of advancing equity, diversity, and inclusion, and then we've seen in COVID that there is data coming out showing that people who have children at home are producing less research. You know, like when you've got clear statistics, they're showing that there is an equity, diversity, inclusion lens through which you look. I just don't understand how administrations can ignore that.
So we've just about reached the end of our time. And so I want very much to thank everybody who has participated, both our panelists, and the excellent discussion that we've had, and participants who have come in and joined us. I think one of the themes that really is underpinning all of this is the direness of this situation and the importance of this fight. I mean, this is fundamentally linked not just to our jobs, our salaries, our ability to do our work, but an erosion of the sort of broader civil rights and social justice gains that we've made over the years. So I think that the pragmatic combination of both talking about the challenges facing us, but really exploring some really good solutions has been just great. And I certainly have learned a great deal. Thank you very much to everybody. Merci beaucoup. And I think that brings us to the end of our town hall. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Right.